Started. If you're ready to go, take it away.
Wonderful. Thanks, Kim. All right. So as Kim said, we are going to be talking about Intelligent Query Architect, or IQA. So I'll be calling it IQA throughout our session. And this is the beginner session. So today what we're going to do is we're going to just kind of get our feet wet, and we're going to create a couple of simple IQA queries depending on how our time works out. And then we're going to kind of use a simple business object, doing filters, and show a little bit of exporting the data out of iMIS. So kind of just getting you started with IQA. So again, IQA stands for the Intelligent Query Architect, and it's used throughout iMIS, especially as we think about using iMIS if you're on version 20. IQA has existed in one way, shape, or form since I think like 10.6. And so you might have it there too if you're on prior versions. So it's somewhat similar. As the versions have changed, they have made improvements along the way. So most people do have access to it. It's used throughout iMIS, especially in the staff site, and if you're using RISE as far as your member site. It pulls together things like lists, communications, if you're going to send out emails. You can create your own searches, and of course, querying data to do some reporting back, looking for number of members or things like that. So IQA can be used in a number of different ways. It's included in iMIS, so there's no extra licensing, which is kind of nice. Again, it can be used in the staff site, and it is in the out-of-the-box staff site used all over, and it's also used and can be used on the member site, so pulling maybe some directories or things like that. IQA uses business objects rather than the tables. So as we go ahead and build our queries, we're going to actually look at the business objects that are out there and use those rather than looking at the underlying tables. And that's just so when you think about all the changes that get made from version to version, ASI might be making changes to the tables, adding additional pieces, but then they fix up the business objects. So the theory says that if you built your queries on those business objects, they'll update the business objects so that way from version to version as you upgrade, your query should not break. So that's kind of one of the nice pieces there. The version of IQA that I'm using now works well with SSRS, so SQL reporting services, to create kind of nice formatted reports. As we look at them today, we're going to kind of keep things fairly simple, and we're going to show queries. And the queries are nice, and you can export it out, like I said before. One of the other aspects is, though, if you'd like something that's nicely formatted, nice headers, subtotaling, things like that, you can use SQL reporting services to do that. Like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about exporting the data. And in version 20, this is available in the staff site only. In prior versions, it was available in the desktop version, but they've kind of removed it as they've gone forward in different versions. So that's what we'll be taking a look at. So getting started with IQA, I am going to show you an environment that is at version 20.2, so one of the more recent versions, so it's 20.2 Q4. So that's the version I'm at, so things might be a little bit different if you're on different versions. And to go into that, I'm going to go to RISE and Intelligent Query Architect. And where I'm going to start is I am going to kind of switch back and forth here a bit. And I'm going to pull across my version of iMIS. So I've logged in, and this is what the staff site looks like when I've logged in. So to go to IQA, again, I say I go to RISE, and then I choose the Intelligent Query Architect. And one kind of little side note or housekeeping piece is if you haven't used IQA before, one of the things to kind of think about is maybe a little bit around housekeeping and kind of that folder structure. It's easier to kind of decide how you want to arrange things sooner rather than later, just because while you can move things around, it's not quite as easy as dragging and dropping, and so sometimes it's easier to kind of plan that out a little bit beforehand. And so what I see here, a lot of these are out of the box. ASI, like I said, uses IQA everywhere, kind of in iMIS, and they're different sites. And so you get a lot of things out of the box. But what I like to do is typically when I come in here to kind of get started, I'll probably create a new folder, and it might be your organization. I might do an InterDyn folder. And that way I can just have a place to put all of my queries. Now, another thing to think of is you can also do subfolders. And so something to think about as far as arranging is you might want to arrange these by maybe department, or if you plan on putting them maybe on your member site versus your staff site, you could break them out into a couple of folders that way. There's a number of different ways. It's just something to kind of think about as you're building these out. So again, I'm just going to use a simple folder here. I'm not going to do a lot of queries. So like I said, where are they going to be used? Maybe the department is a good way to look at it. So the first step we're going to do is we're going to go to define. And this is how we kind of start out building our query. And so now that I'm in my folder, I'm going to say I want a new query. From here, first thing that I need to do, and you'll notice it has the red asterisk, is I'm going to name my query. So for example, maybe I want to run or find all of my expired members. And I can put a description in here if I like. So something along those lines. One thing that you note, if you've never used IQA before, the first time that you come in here, you might notice, oh, I think I'm missing some options. I would say first thing you should do, and this is only if it's your first time in, once you do this once, it really sticks with your user, is make sure that you move out of basic mode into advanced mode. It just makes sure you have all of the options available for you to build out your queries and run them and kind of have all the options. So once you set this, though, and it's set to advanced mode, it'll remain in advanced mode. So it's not as if you have to remember to do that every time. So just a little note if you come in and look at it and think there's maybe some pieces missing. So once I've kind of named it and given it a description, I can then go down here to sources. And sources are those business objects that we're going to look at. And so if I do add a source here, this is a list of all the business objects that are available to me. And these right now are kind of some of the out-of-the-box ones that IQA comes with, a lot of different business objects. And I think one of the most frequent questions that I hear is like, how do I know which business objects to use? And in all honesty, it's a bit of an art and a science that you kind of start getting a feel of, oh, this is maybe one that's going to have my information. As we go through, there are upcoming webinars, and one of them focuses on business objects. So that might be one to think about too. But what you can do is you kind of start getting a feel of there's certain ones that you use maybe kind of over and over again. Things like if you're looking for people, I want a list of people. Typically we'll use something called CS Contact. And rather than scroll through all these, one of the other things I can do is just start typing, and it'll narrow down my list, which is kind of nice rather than trying to dig through those. So I'm going to choose CS Contact. I'm going to jump back here. We talked about summary. We talked about sources. We left from the business object. Like I said, CS Contact, a list of people and organizations. A few of the other ones that are commonly used are things like CS Orders. If you're looking for order information, CS Event is going to have event information. And a couple of others that I can think of right off the top of my head are things like committee members. Well, if we have time, we'll take a look at doing one with the committee members. That's pretty slick. And the other one is CS Activity. The activity table or the activity business object contains all of those things like if they've attended meetings and you've closed the meetings. You can look for if you're tracking call activity. If you're doing any type of activity, you can dig that out of the activity business object. So see if activity is another one. So next we're going to talk about filters. And filters are the pieces that narrow things down. Once I add in my source here, I have my business object added. I'm going to go to filters. And the filters are where I say, these are who I want to narrow it down. So maybe I'm looking for, again, those expired members that I want to find out who is expired. So there's a few things that I might be able to look for. If I hit the drop down here, I'm going to see all of the fields that are a part of that business object that I've selected. And so if I'm thinking about this, usually one of the first things I like to do is I like to look for status. And the status is, if you think about in the iMIS desktop, along the top, if you look at a person's record in the customer portfolio, it'll say, like, usually most of yours are going to be active. You could have inactives. You could have people that are marked for deletion that you haven't maybe cleared out yet. And so typically I like to say, oh, you know what, I only want to pull in active people. And again, depending on your query, you may say that's good or maybe want to do something different. And then one of the things that I want to make sure to mention is that every time you add a filter, you need to hit this plus sign and then it changes over to an X, because that actually adds it. One of the most common things, and I know I'll probably do it, maybe even a part of this webinar, is sometimes you forget, you put the last thing in and you forget to hit the add, and then it doesn't add your filter. You run it and you're like, oh, the results aren't what I expected. I go back and look at my filters and say, yeah, I forgot to actually hit the plus sign. Because we're looking for expired members, maybe I want to take a look at member types. And so I want to say that my member type is equal to, and I can choose any of these member types. Maybe I'm only looking at company members that are expired, maybe associate members, things like that. So I can choose company member. I'm going to hit the plus sign. Next one is, because I'm looking for expired people, I want to take a look at the paid through date. But instead of being equal to a specific date, maybe I want to say that I want to look for paid through dates that are less than or equal to, and I can choose a date. So we'll say today's date. Anything less than or equal to today means they've technically expired, and so I want to see them on the list. The other thing we have here is the prompt. Right now, I have these couple of items that say no to prompt, meaning when I go to run this query as a user, do I want to ask the user, whoever's going to run the query, to provide this information, or do I always want it to run a certain way? Maybe for the status and member type, that's fine. I always want to say it's a certain status and certain member type. But maybe for the paid through date, I want them to be able to, change that. So what I can do is I can make it optional. And what it'll do is say, oh, they can provide it if they'd like. If they don't want to, that's fine. Or I could make it required that they can't run the query without providing that information. So I can do one or the other there. And then what I can also do is in this last column that doesn't have a heading, this is where I can kind of put a nice little label as far as the filter when you go to run it. I might want to say, please verify the correct pay through date to run the query. Something along those lines. So you can put in whatever you like. It's just if you want something that's a little bit nicer, you can put that in. So I can continue to add these different filters and as many as I need, and I can either make them optional or required or not even ask the user as they go to run this. So that is kind of simple filters, of course. And so we talked about we can select one or more fields. I want to go back. I'll tell you about the comparison value, the prompt, and the text, and always remember to click on Add. The one thing that I did skip over is there is this comparison, and depending on the field, this will change. So, for example, the paid through date, it knows that it's a date, so I get this between option. I can do within X amount of days, months, years, things like that. But if I look at member type, you'll notice that that changes a little bit. I don't have those options. So it's smart enough to say, based on your data that you're looking at, I'm going to say you can do these particular comparison values, which is kind of nice. Next tab is the display tab. And this is going to show me what fields I should display on this particular query. And so right now, because there's just this kind of default set of values that it wants to pull back, I already have this kind of list of the fields that it thinks it's going to display. And so what I can do is I can do a number of things. I can remove all these and set up my own. I may want to reorder them because maybe it makes more sense if it's in a different order. I know I typically, just as kind of habit, if I'm looking at people, I might want to say, oh, I always want to see the iMIS ID in the first field. So I might update that to a 1, click refresh, and then it moves it up to the first column on my query. And so then I kind of take a look at, and I'm like, you know what, as I read, maybe the first name should be, or the full name should be in the second column. Maybe I want to see what company they're with. Maybe I want to remove one and say, you know what, country, maybe we all only have domestic members, so country isn't something that's very useful. Member type, state, province, city, so depending on the fields I want. When I click refresh, it'll take country out. But maybe there's some additional fields that I want to see. So then I'll go ahead and click the drop down here, and it'll say view all columns. So this will show me all of the fields that I have available to me. And so maybe there's things like I want to pull together a list of email addresses, and that's what I'm going to do, because maybe I'm going to put together a mailing for these folks. So I might select email. Maybe I want to see their full address. Maybe I'm creating a phone list for these folks, and that we're going to actually call them up and say, hey, you know, I see you've expired. You know, what can we do to get you to renew? And maybe I also want to show what their paid through date actually is. You know, how long have they been expired? So I'll click on those, and then when I click refresh, it will update the list of columns, and then I can reorder the rest if I like. So it's kind of the simple way to do this. Other things that you can do is, for kind of the simple pieces, you can provide an alias. An alias is just a different column heading, and so maybe if you think, oh, you know what, we only have members that are within the United States, we don't have anything, you know, any Canadian members or anything, maybe I just want this to say state, not state province. Maybe rather than paid through, I want to say expiration date, just to make this a little bit easier for folks. If you don't provide an alias, it'll just use the field property name, and so if you're like, that's fine, you know what, iMIS ID makes sense, I don't think I'd call it anything different, you can leave it as is. I'm not going to delve too deeply into link and subtotal. Those are topics that I will plan to cover in next month's webinar, and I think I have the date later on in my slide deck. But that we'll kind of take what we learned today and kind of build on that next month and do kind of what we call the intermediate set webinar to kind of take the next step and build things out. So I'm going to cover those a little bit later, but this is kind of just to get you going. So I have those pieces, and let's just refer back here. We talked about the filters. We select the fields. We can assign an alias, that's that column heading. There is the ability to do subtotling, and that's one of those things that's kind of an advanced topic. And then we can also reorder those columns to say, I want this to be the first column, this to be the second column, and so forth. So those pieces. And then the last kind of piece is the sorting. And the sorting is going to say, what order are these records going to show up in? So I have my list of people that have expired, and how do I want them to sort? Do I want them to sort by last name? Do I want to sort by company? Maybe I want to, knock off company by company, kind of depending on how your membership works, if you have company members versus individual members, things like that. So when I go to sorting, sorting is going to allow me to say what field do you want to sort by. And so I know that there is a field called name first to last, so it's their last name and then their first name, and I want to sort by that. And like the filters, you want to make sure you hit this plus sign here, that it'll make sure it actually includes your sorting. So then, kind of once you have this really built out, you're thinking, oh, it looks pretty good. You may want to consider saving this. So if I click on Save, what it'll do is it'll say, here's the folder I'm in. I'm in that InterDyn folder I created right off the bat. And then it tells me the name. So if I decided, ooh, I don't love the name, I could call it something else at this point. So then I'll click on OK. And that way it saved that version. So it's saved out there. If I closed it now, I could come back to it later. If you want to see the results and kind of take a look at the query, what you can do up here is click on this Run tab. And this will be kind of, as you go to just execute the query, what it would look like. And so it says, please verify the correct paid through date. And so that's today's date. And so I'm like, yep, that makes sense. And maybe you want to change the verbiage. It can kind of say whatever you'd like. And then I'm going to click on Find. And then it should have given me a list of those members. And I think I'm looking at companies here. And it pulled them back. Now I'm thinking, oh, the sort's a little weird because I think I sorted by last name, first name, and I'm only looking at company members. And so one of the nice pieces is I can do this Run option and then just click back over to Define and say, oh, yeah, that wasn't very smart. I didn't want name. Instead, I wanted to look at company. I'm going to hit the plus sign again. And what I can do now is if I just go back, I changed it to company, and I clicked on Run, it'll run it, and then I can verify that, yep, that's what I wanted. One of the things to make a note of is that if you choose to just run the query at this point, it doesn't actually save it. So if I close out, that change I made to the sorting wouldn't get picked up. It doesn't know that I did that. And so what I want to make sure of is that if I look at this now and say, yes, that's perfect, that's exactly what I wanted, I will click on Save again, and that way I have my particular members. So kind of one of those things to kind of think about as you're building these out. And one of the things I like to do is, save often if I'm making changes. I kind of keep incrementally making changes and then save it and kind of look at it. I'm going to jump back over then. We talked about sorting. And like I said, when you use the Run option, it will execute the query without doing any saving. So you want to do a save to save all the changes. So now I have this great query, and maybe I want to export this out. And I can export this out in any number of different options. This particular one, I can do an export to Word. So I will go ahead and create a file that will be consumable by Word. I can do an export to Excel. So this can go to an Excel spreadsheet. I can do it as a PDF, or I can do it as a CSV file, which is just the comma to the limited file. And so I can drop it in, and also goes into Excel quite nicely. And you can break those up and modify these if you want to move things around or that kind of thing. It's kind of whatever your preference is. And then with some of the queries, you can actually export to XML. If you want to see what the XML looks like, that's an option too. And so that's the exporting results. So that was one query, and I think we're doing okay on time. So I am going to go back, and I think we'll do one more. I'm going to save or close out of that, and now you'll see that I've expired members here. So let's do another query, a new one, and this one is going to be committee members. And actually, let's do current committee members. Now, as far as sources, sometimes you kind of are like, oh, I don't know. And so when I click on Add a Source, you can scroll through and see, oh, I wonder what they have out here. One of the things you might think of is, oh, you know what, I know when they're on committees that I get activity records. So I could build this out of activity and do that. But what I also kind of might want to think about is maybe they have a special one. Maybe there is one for committee. And they do. So I'm thinking, I want committee members. So let's see if I use the CS committee member business object, what it has in it. And so sometimes I, might get started and say, oh, it didn't quite have the fields I wanted, and maybe I need to add more pieces in or use a different business object, but at least I like to start with one here. So as I think a bit about this, I want the current committee members. So a couple of things to think about is, do I want to say, oh, I want this to only be a certain committee, or do I want to build it kind of flexible so I could run this for any committee? I'm going to do an option here that says I want to filter by committee name, where the committee name is equal to, and then I get this drop-down list so that a person could choose which committee they want to run it for. I can also say that maybe they can choose multiple committees. Maybe I want to pull a list together that has, a few committees kind of lumped together. By choosing this, it allows them to run the query for both one or multiple committees at a single time. And of course, if I'm going to allow that, I want to say maybe this is optional. And I make sure that I put that in. And again, I could put in here one or more committees. Now, the other thing that I said is, I think I want to have current committee members. If they've already, their term is ended, I don't really care. So what I may want to do is I want to look at the term end date. And it didn't say that. And I chose the wrong one. Let's do term end. Okay, perfect. So I might want to say that the term end is less than or equal to today's date. And maybe I want to say, you know what, since this is a current query, I don't want to ask the user for that. I want to have them try to figure that out. So I might want to say no to that. Then as I think about this, I'm like, oh, you know what, sometimes when we're doing data entry, and I don't know if this happens in your organizations, that you'll say, oh, sometimes we put in a term end date. So we have committees that, for example, they're 3-year terms. So we know if they started, January 1st of 2015, they'll be done at the end of 2018. And so we know that. Maybe you have open-ended ones where we don't have a term date or a term end date. So what you can do here is, if I were to run this, and it's less than today, and what I may want to do here is I'm going to come back to display. This one doesn't have any columns selected by default, so I'm going to choose some of my own. So maybe I want to see things like, I want to see the ID. And I can keep clicking refresh and it'll kind of keep moving them up here, or I can select multiple at the same time. Maybe their full name and their email address, the organization or company, where do they work, things like that. And maybe I want to see, you know, do they have a specific position on the committee. So if I click refresh now, it kind of just puts them in an order, and yep, that'll be okay. And I can come over to the sorting tab and say, let's do something like, I'm first going to sort by committee name, and that will only really apply if I'm running it for multiple committees. And then let's do it by last first. You could also do things like, because this is a committee query, you may want to consider doing it by position rank, where you say, oh, you know what, I want the president, if you're using position ranks when you're putting them in, depending on how your committees break down. I want to see, you know, the president of the committee or the committee chair at the top, and because their position has a higher rank, that would work. So I put that in, and actually let me swap that around with last first. So first by committee, then by the rank, and then by their name. And so then, if I'm thinking, oh, this is feeling pretty good, I'm going to click on Save. Again, it tells me the folder, and then it tells me what it's going to be named. I could change that now. And then I'm going to run this. So I could select, or maybe Board of Directors. Well, that's strange. I got nothing back, and I think, well, okay. What if I just run this for any committee? And I might get a list, and I'm thinking, you know what, that's still pretty small. I think I have more committee members. What I'm going to do is this. I'm going to come over to the filters and say, oh, you know what, sometimes we have those open-ended committees where we didn't put in a term and date, so maybe that's the problem. What I can do is I can choose this Add Filter option and say that the term end date is less than or equal to day, or, and I can use that field again, so my term end date, and it always seems to not catch that the first time. Term end date is empty. So if I know, oh, you know what, that data, it's blank, there isn't a term end date for some people, I can add that in. So I'm looking at both of those conditions. Where it does have a date, it's going to look at it and say, oh, is it less than or equal to today's date, or is it empty? And if I run this, looks like I'm getting a few more records. I'm getting all 100, and I think, oh, you know what, that seems about right. So that's one way to kind of get the additional pieces, or to make sure if your data is a little bit disjointed, where, you know, in some cases we're looking for this, in other cases we're looking for something else, you can kind of use that or filter, and it'll say this or this can be true. And so that's kind of a nice way to do that. I think, yep, this is okay. I'm going to click on Save. And now I have that particular query saved. So I'm going to jump back here. So that's just kind of a very simple, very straightforward. We didn't do anything really fancy, but it kind of gets your feet wet. One of the other things I would say, if you're new to building queries, one of the things I would recommend is that you kind of build it piece by piece. Maybe you say, oh, you know what, when I'm going to define this, maybe I'm not really sure what filters I want. And so maybe I want to say, oh, am I getting the right term end dates? Maybe my end result, I don't really want to see that, but to kind of build it out just to verify what I'm getting, let's add this in. Let's run it. and say, oh yeah, this is good. This is why I wanted to have the term end date. And so when I didn't get any data returned, what I typically do is say, ooh, I bet you there's something up with my filters, and I maybe start deleting them or removing them and figure out which is the one that's kind of causing the issue, and then I might start looking at the data to make sure, am I really sure that my data is what I'm looking for, and kind of match those things up. So kind of one of the things to build incrementally. Sometimes it's also hard if you build, you spend a half hour trying to build this fantastic query, and then you get to the end and you realize you don't get any data back. Why is that? And if you've built it piece by piece and make sure, okay, I'm looking for, a big group, and then I'm narrowing it in, sometimes it's a little bit easier to troubleshoot. Documentation. ASI has some pretty good documentation, and so if you go to help.imis.com, and in the search, if you just search for IQA, it'll take you to kind of the big area that they have for the IQA documentation, and it's fairly decent, so hopefully that will help kind of refresh your memory or get you started. And then, like I said, upcoming training. We will be doing intermediate training. So if you're like, okay, I think, I have this down. I kind of like to learn some more about some additional topics, because there's a lot of things I didn't cover today. We can do things like, for example, the date. I was always saying, well, today's date. Well, who wants to keep updating that date? There's a variable we can use instead. So we'll talk about things like that. We'll talk about kind of doing some totaling, kind of some advanced topics. So that will be held on November 23rd, I think it's the day before Thanksgiving, same time, 11 o'clock Central Time. And then I think in December is business objects. So kind of building on those topics is business objects is the December topic. So a couple of things to kind of keep in mind. And then I think I'm open for questions.
All right, everybody, that's great. So on the right-hand side, you'll see the question area. If you have a question you'd like to ask Michelle, type that in right now. And I don't see any yet. So what are some common questions that you do hear? Obviously, you laid this out, but maybe just to get the pump going here, what questions do you often hear about this topic?
I think one of the hardest ones, and this is the one that I don't have the excellent answer for, the simple answer is, how do I know what business objects to use? And a lot of it is, trying a business object, you're thinking, oh, you know what, I want people. I know that maybe that's contact or name, and so I might look and search for those. And sometimes what ends up happening is I might add a business object, and then I might realize, oh, it's not quite what I wanted. And sometimes I'll add a business object, don't do anything with the filters, and just see what they have for the display field and decide, oh, is that pretty close? Yes, I'll go with that, or no, I won't. So.
Excellent. Do you advise people to try it in like a test environment, or won't they break anything if they just go ahead and start just doing some experimenting?
No, and that's kind of the beauty of things, that you don't need to, because this is just a reporting tool, that you can do it in your production environment, because the worst thing that happens is you have a query that returns no results and you just don't get any information. It won't modify your data or do anything like that, so that's one of the nice pieces. And so give it a go. I haven't heard of anyone doing anything that has, broken iMIS in any way, shape, or form. So.
All right. All right, here's a question. We got it going now. Can you clone queries?
Yes. They don't actually call it cloning, but it's something close. What you can do is, I'm sitting in that current committee members. I can use the save as option, and then I can say maybe I want to look at expired committee members. I'll say okay and save that. You'll notice it switches me over so I can tell I'm in the right query, and maybe then I go and say, oh, you know what, I want to see, that their, date is this. So it's the save as option is what the clone is.
Okay. All right. Well, here's one I think I might know the answer, so let me take first stabs just for fun. Sue asked the questions. On the first query, It was paid through October 2016. The results showed expiration dates of 2011 and 2012. Why is that? And I'm thinking it's because that's the sample data. Is that the right answer?
It is, and actually, yep, it is. And actually, I was looking at this query and thinking I wasn't very smart on this particular query when I was doing the current ones, because the current ones should have been greater than or equal to today's date. So if you were confused by that, you should have been, and so I apologize if that makes sense, that when I was doing the current committee members, it should have been need to refresh my folder, greater than date, but going back to expired members. And so if I think of expired, they're the ones that, if you think about when you do and when people pay their dues, their paid through date would go out to a future date. So for example, if I became a member, we'll say today, it's the 20th, and maybe it's, you know, an exact year that I wouldn't, my paid through date then would be October of 2017. And so thinking about that, those people would be not expired. Anybody that is expired would have a date sometime in the past. And so some of these folks, when we look at them, they're really expired, and they've been expired for a few years. And this is demo data, so that's why a lot of them are a few years past. ASI just doesn't update their data very often.
That qualified me as certified? Haha. No.
Certainly.
I'm just kidding. Here's another one. Can we still use crystal reports? Are they going away?
Yeah. They're going away. And so here's kind of the lowdown on crystal reports is that, yes, you absolutely can continue to use them. They are only available out of the desktop, or kind of the classic view, or whatever you want to call it. And so they're still all available there. The Crystal report engine is still there. And so I would say probably 100%, I haven't heard of anyone that hasn't, is still using those out-of-the-box reports, because you may have modified them. You might have things like invoices and things like that that you can use Crystal reports for. Now, with that said, eventually, and when I say eventually, in my mind I think 5 years, something like that, eventually the desktop will go away, and that I don't know if they'll do anything as far as bridging that gap with the Crystal reports. I know as they continue to do new releases, you get more and more kind of out-of-the-box queries and reports in the staff site. But for, in my mind, the foreseeable future, that Crystal reports will still all be available.
Sounds good. So if you were just beginning to use this and was to go out and pick a typical reporting tool, which one is the most popular?
I would say that if I were starting out, and this is, I guess, what we recommend to a lot of our clients, is we say, you know what, Crystal is a little bit limited because you have to kind of use those older versions of Crystal reports, if any of you are familiar with having to do that. If I were building new things, I would maybe start gravitating towards using IQA and maybe SSRS, because it's going to be the new technology. It's going to be where things are. So as I build new stuff, that might be the direction I would say. But it's not to say if you're like, oh, we just really like Crystal, that's fine. But like I said, I would say eventually it's going to go away. But when that actually would happen, I have no idea. I think it's a ways out in the future.
Yep. That product's been around about 30 years. All right.
Yeah.
Here's one from Cindy, and I think this might be your last question in the queue right now. Is there a way to save the data you run inside iMIS similar to what you do in Access?
I'm not quite sure. So here's my initial thought. Maybe I'm not understanding the question very well, so if I'm not, just let me know. So we can save, like, as I look at this list or this query, what I would say if you're saying, oh, I want to save this data, I would say I would save it out, like I clicked on this W for the Word export, and it actually creates an export file. This one happens to be the Word file. And then it opened up over here. And so then I have this query kind of at this point in time. Is that what you were thinking, or something a little bit different?
I'll see if she responds. Otherwise, there are no other questions in the queue. So what parting thoughts do you have? And we'll let folks get back to their busy day.
I think it's just, like I said, IQA is something that you can kind of just start messing around with. You won't break anything, so it's like, you know what, I want to pull a simple list, do that. Eventually, that if you think and use out of the desktop the ad hoc queries, that's something that IQA is kind of like that. And so, what practice, and like I said, we're going to be building on it next month, and so kind of taking the next step. So something to look forward to.
Excellent. And Cindy just came back and said, was that what you showed saved within iMIS?
Nope, it definitely wasn't. Only the query itself is saved in iMIS, so I can come back and run it as many times as I want. But the data itself is, or that list of data, is not saved into iMIS. It's saved. It could be saved out as a Word document, as an Excel doc, but it's not saved within iMIS. So hopefully that makes sense.
Sounds good. All right, sounds great. And oops, here comes another one. Can someone join or become a member and register for a conference at the same time?
In RISE, not out of the box. That has been one of the things that we're kind of hoping for and pushing for. And we've done a few kind of workarounds that have had, limited, I would say, success. But out of the box, currently today, as we speak, no, it's a separate process where if I'm going to become a member, I need to become a member, check out, and then come back in, basically log in again and say, okay, now I want to register for an event or I want to buy a product, and then I'll get pricing that supports that. So unfortunately today, no, although I kind of feel like that's one of the things that's probably in the hopper, but what release that happens, I don't know.
Sounds good. Great education. Thank you so much, Michelle, and I hope everyone appreciated it. We'll put this recording out in our YouTube library, but hey, go back, look at some of the past ones as well, and let everybody in your office know. Thank you, everybody. Make it a great day.